So I want your attention for at least a few minutes. I want to welcome you. This is a nice springtime day here in Washington, D.C., and I know many people have come from far away. And so I want to welcome you to our conference on fueling innovation in the global economy. This conference, as you know, is co-organized and co-sponsored by George Washington University and the University of Minnesota. And so I am Reed Click. I am the faculty director of the George Washington University Center for International Business Education and Research, the GW-CIBER. And without the support, both for the organizational side and the financial side, we wouldn't have been able to do this without the cyber grant that we get from the Department of Education or from the University of Minnesota, who's actually represented here in a couple of different ways. I will say a couple of things about the cyber and about the agenda, and then I'll turn it over to our Vice Dean, Jennifer Spencer, and Anu Feeney. Before I do all of that, I actually do want to extend my sincere gratitude to Anu Feeney and to Paul Valler for organizing this. I've seen a lot of the activity. I have been involved in a fair amount of the minutiae involved as well, but I think nobody's been involved more heavily than Anu with all of the local host arrangements, and to Paul for his input as well. And so the George Washington University CIBER undertakes a series of things geared toward outreach as well as research and curriculum support. And the CIBER has several focal areas. And I think you may want to know that we actually have a focal area in innovation. It's called Innovation and Property Rights. This conference is more about the innovation. But it's because the cyber grant is awarded by the U.S. Department of Education to broadly support U.S. competitiveness. And I actually can't think of anything as important as innovation in enhancing U.S. competitiveness. And so this is one of our keystone events associated with innovation and how innovation supports U.S. competitiveness, although I know that the topics that you see today are quite varied, involving elements that might not appear on the surface to affect U.S. competitiveness. But in that regard, any research on innovation of high quality is an important output of our cyber. And so the cyber actually allows us to do some things that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise, and this kind of conference is one of them. And so the grant is from the U.S. Department of Education, and if you are paying taxes here in the United States, I want to thank you for supporting our endeavors here today. I want to say a couple things about our partnership with the University of Minnesota. We had a great conference last week in Minnesota, and so the Carlson School at the University of Minnesota hosted us, and I went to Minnesota. I think that, in contrast, the weather this week in Washington is better than last week in Minnesota. When I arrived in Minnesota, it was snowing. And to my knowledge, there's actually, the people from Minnesota are now embarrassed. But the snow plays another role here because I actually can't be with you for the conference today. I will see you if you're joining us for the evening events, but I can't be with you for the conference today because of the snow. And that might sound a little strange, but today is a reading day, and we had scheduled this conference to begin today, knowing that everybody should be available, right? Everybody on this end would be available. Yesterday was also a reading day, but we were allowed to have some curricular events. And unfortunately, back in February or maybe March, snow on a Thursday meant that yesterday became a makeup day for classes. So all of the events that were scheduled for yesterday have been moved to today. And so that means today I'm double booked. And so I had a nice lunch upstairs. I couldn't join you for your lunch, but I hope it was nice here as well. And so I hope you have good sessions today. I've looked at the papers and the abstracts, and I'm delighted to have all of you here. And I will see you later tonight or tomorrow morning. And so with that, I guess I want to turn this over now to Jennifer Spencer. I need to thank her as well, and I want to thank Heather Berry for their local inputs into this conference. But I'm introducing Jennifer Spencer in her capacity as Vice Dean of Faculty. Is that okay?
Double booked today, and I'm really excited to have a few days of thinking about research and not thinking about memos and reappointment cases and the like. Reed actually just popped out. He didn't say what he was doing, which is actually very interesting. I believe where he's going to is he's leading a group of students to Rwanda in a couple of weeks, and I think they're doing their final presentations today. They're doing consulting projects with small firms in Rwanda, and so he's working through their projects, and so that's also something that's partly sponsored by our CIBER. Dean's office hat on. In his last will and testament, George Washington envisioned the creation of a new institution to create citizen leaders in the nation's capital for his new country. And after his death in 1821, President Monroe signed the act of Congress that created the institution that became George Washington University. In 1928, our business school was founded, and it was founded on the notion, which was actually quite new at the time, that business and government could work together to ensure prosperity of the country and economic development of the world. And actually, our business faculty today have the mission and the objective of continuing to think about these issues at the intersection of business and government and the social environment, business society, and public policy. In fact, it's GW's mission to serve as a catalyst of conversation and discussion on issues about how firms are embedded in this broader context, political, social, national, and global context. And that's what most of what we're talking about today and tomorrow are really about. When I look at topics such as knowledge, markets, and institutions, financial capital, building intellectual capital, outsourcing, and other types of issues, you can really see that vision coming through very strongly. And that's actually why we have as the CIBER, one of the lead sort of mission of the CIBER is to think about issues related to institutions, policies, and development. And so together, I hope that we can all sort of work to discuss and understand these issues about how firms are embedded in this national and global context related to innovation. So welcome to GW. And I know we're going to have a great time talking about these topics, and I hope we can also relax a little bit this evening on a nice boat cruise, seeing the monuments and seeing the seat of our capital. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Anufini, who can also welcome you. You're going to get lots of welcomes this morning, and also maybe give you some logistical instructions.
Well, welcome everybody. I'm going to keep this short. I'm so pleased. I don't have to kind of sell the idea of innovation in the global economy here, because everybody here really believes in it. And I think I'm really happy to have all of you here to put together this really interesting program that we have. So, we'll begin with John and his opening keynote. Then we'll segue into the paper presentation. So we have Aya, Gurneeta, Deepak, and Jeff that will present, and we'll have discussions by Nandini and Jordan. And then we'll have some fun later in the evening. And tomorrow we'll begin with a practitioner panel, because we thought we should have something that's very DC. So some unique policy and development perspectives on innovation and IP. And then we will have an academic panel too. So I'm looking forward to that, because I know we have Paul, who's going to moderate it. We have Paul Almeida, Heather, who's also participating on that, and Naki, who'll be on the panel. So looking forward to getting some new ideas on interesting research that we could be doing. And then we'll conclude with a closing keynote from Joanne. I know Reed sort of said at the outset about what it kind of takes to put this together, but it was not just me. Heather, Jenny, Rob, and Reed all contributed a lot. But we just thought it up, right? It's really, you've all been in touch with Alexis and Navena, who really put this into play, right? So it's really all because of them. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Paul.
Thank you, Anna. So you should probably get relaxed. I'll be talking for quite a while. Just a few things. I'll introduce John for the keynote, and that's really why we're here, is to learn and to hear from great leaders in the field, international business and innovation. Again, let me just reiterate a few things, which is we have a terrific group of people coming from academia and from practice areas here, and George Washington's a fantastic place for this. I can't help but respond a little bit to Reed's note about the meteorological challenges in Minnesota. I like to think that Minnesota is not so much cold and hot, it's a theater of the seasons. And then sometimes in April you get all three of the theaters and all three of the seasons and then some in one day. And we got those for it. What he doesn't tell you is we had a beautiful day for the conference that we held on doing business in sub-Saharan Africa, in particular, and a couple of terrific panels on diaspora investment issues. And I think that's really one of the things that was a great pairing of GW's position at the interstices of business and policy on an international sense and development sense, and in the University of Minnesota's position as geographic and demographic position as the headquarters of the center of two very large diasporas in West Africa and Liberia and Somalia. And so pairing that together was a great learning experience. And I have the same kind of expectations for the great learning opportunity here with academics and practitioners together. Let me just also say that I think it was Richard Nixon who once said there are people who are responsible and people who are to blame for things, and for everything that is wonderful here that you see today, there are so many people at GW to thank, starting with Anu and Alexis, who are responsible for that. And for anything that are ever hiccups and things, you can blame it right here on the co-organizer. So talk to me about it. I'm just so pleased. Thank you for all you've done, Anu, Alexis, and so many others here. So let me now do the thing that I'm supposed to do, which is introduce John, our first keynote for it. There are all of us, I think, when we get into academia, one of our goals is to nudge a conversation about ideas in a better direction. We want to just push it a little bit here and there. John's research around international business and innovation hasn't just nudged, it's shoved, sometimes kicked, maybe sometimes kicking and screaming. Coming out of Reading, not surprisingly, is around these issues of international business and innovation, but his work, in particular, his work around the multinational innovation in the late 1980s, did so much to change conversations about the nature of technology and international business from mere discussions about technology transfer to how we build networks and how those networks complement one another in the often complex process of developing new products and ideas that cross borders, not just when they come into being, but as they're coming into being. And John's work on that has done so much to kick us ahead in good directions for that. And I'm looking forward to hearing about where that debate is going next with this keynote. John also doesn't just write about these ideas and influence debates. He helps, if you will, pay for the foundation that goes with it. Doing service to our profession is something for which the thanks are rarely, if ever, coming. John has done so much of it, most recently as the editor-in-chief of GIBS. And I always like to say, in case you don't know whether you're good at what you're doing, it's whenever you're reelected to it, I guess, that you find out. And so you've been reelected for that. You're doing a great job. So we appreciate so much your leadership on that for what is the flagship journal in our field. There are other things that John can tell you about. I could try to summarize, but he can do it so much better. So without further ado, I'd like to invite John up to give our keynote speaker. Welcome.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Paul, for those very kind remarks. And it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. I think I know just about everybody here. Maybe there are one or two I haven't met before, but it is, clearly this is a meeting of one's peers, and so it's a great pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity to talk to you today. I need to remember, don't I, to switch this on. There we are. So that maybe we don't need... Should I switch this off? Yeah. Okay. So hopefully that will be all right for you. Good. So what I want to talk about is not particularly actually to do with US competitiveness, which was what the cyber director had mentioned, but although US competitiveness does come indirectly into this discussion. But I want to talk about the global spread of innovative activity, in some ways not just within the United States, but also in many other countries across the world. It's quite well known now that innovative activity, and not just low-wage, low-cost types of activity, is often now taking off in countries like India and China. And so, in a paper a little while ago, we asked ourselves the question, well, what role is international business playing in this? And of course, it connects directly to what Paul has just mentioned, because what are the international business networks that link together innovative activity in multiple locations? What is the role of globalization, broadly defined, and in economic terms, international trade and foreign direct investment, in connecting activities, innovative activities in different places, and giving rise essentially to the emergence of newer producers of technology? I might say as an aside, but this does actually connect to the point about international networks immediately, that one conclusion I think I would draw from these from this area of research is that predominantly these are not substitution effects. So the rise of innovation in places like India and China and elsewhere is largely complementary, in fact, to innovative activity in the United States. It's not essentially undermining it, as might sometimes have been thought in some of the competitiveness literature. But perhaps we can come back to that point later. And of course, to the extent that globalization does influence the relocation of innovative activity, that makes the point. It's because you have knowledge-based networks across national boundaries that are connecting these types of activity, as well as, from a development perspective, giving opportunities for new players to come into the game. So what we then asked ourselves is, well, how does globalization or international business activity connect to this relocation of innovation, but relocation of innovation rather broadly defined? So I should perhaps say right at the outset that normally in innovation studies, because in a sense, I wear kind of two hats. I'm involved very much in the international business literature, and that's my main home. But I also have some foot in the innovation studies camp. And in innovation studies these days, we generally define innovation, unlike very often in the popular press, in very broad terms. In other words, we mean problem-solving activity, broadly defined. So problem-solving activity can occur anywhere. It's not just at the notional technology frontier. Economists tend to think sometimes that technology is narrowly defined, and therefore innovation, almost by definition, can happen only in places like the United States. But by taking the broader perspective on systems of innovation, that this is essentially problem-solving activity in the context in which it occurs, then it's quite clear that in places like India and China, innovative activity is happening in this broader sense. But then, of course, the next issue is, well, we need some kind of subdivision because not all innovative activity is equivalent. And so what we do in our work very often is to try and break this down into different kind of stages or phases of development. So relatively early stage development, where you have innovative capability, but it's essentially basic capabilities, and later stages of development, which is based on more advanced capabilities connected to things like research and development and giving rise to patents. So in the paper I did with Athray, we examined these questions, and we looked at the global distribution of innovation geographically across countries. We then essentially use two major sources of evidence. On the one hand, we were using licensing revenues, international licensing revenues. So in other words, what receipts do you get for your intellectual property, which is then traded across national boundaries? And this, of course, is a rather broad definition of innovation. So it includes things, for example, like films or movies, as well as software. And of course patents are one subcategory. So Bollywood, for example, would be quite prominent in Indian revenues. But indeed, this broader type of intellectual property definition therefore allows us to pick up more early stage kinds of capability. And then we looked also at foreign origin patents granted in the United States by the US Patent and Trademark Office, which is here in DC, in fact. This was an indicator, this is an indicator of higher, more advanced stage kinds of innovative capabilities. And what we then did was to calculate an index of geographic concentration across countries and to examine the change in this index over time and the influences on that index of factors related to international business efforts. So the measure itself is essentially picking up the degree of unevenness, or on the other side, the reciprocal or inverse of this would be the degree of dispersion of innovative activity across locations. What we see is essentially something like this. The triangles at the top are the licensing revenues. There's no significance here to the rather peculiar year 1972, I think it was, because that's the year in which the data got compiled rather differently. There's a change in the data source. So that's basically a structural transition rather than something that happens within the data themselves. But what you can see is in terms of licensing revenues, or in our case, we were describing these as basic innovative capabilities, catch-up has been going on since around the mid-1970s, or at least certainly by the mid-80s, while in terms of patents, that is more advanced types of capabilities, catch-up has been going on since the early 1990s. So this confirms what, anecdotally people have observed, namely that innovative activity has emerged in countries such as India and China and has become increasingly significant relative to innovative efforts elsewhere in the world. I should say that the referees or the reviewers of this article at the time said, well, we need to know more than this. We need to know which countries it is that are, as it were, increasing in share. So within the paper, you'll see that it is indeed countries like India and China. It's not Germany, for example, catching up with Japan. It's newer producers of technology, such as India and China, and there are others too. There is also increasing evidence, in fact, that is consistent with this, that, for example, Kazakhstan has been looking at the relocation of some of the R&D facilities that have been in Japan to China, which is quite a significant now shift or relocation of activity. So this is indeed consistent with the notion that catch-up in places such as China is increasingly also in higher grade types of innovative effort. But we then wanted to know, well, how do direct investment and trade connect to this? And our findings are essentially that inward direct investment is important in the case of the more advanced kinds of capability as represented in the patent data. So that's where we see an important impact of direct investment, on average, of course, across countries, by virtue of the method. Excuse me. However, when we're talking about earlier stage development, as mirrored in the licensing data, what we see there is direct investment plays less of a role. It's more openness to trade, and in particular, openness to trade in one particular sense, which is intellectual property markets. So the opening up of intellectual property markets has created new opportunities. So while a number of development economists were rather critical, for instance, of TRIPS in terms of its development implications, what we have observed is that actually these measures that have harmonized intellectual property regimes have in many ways been helpful for newer players to get into the game, because they can sell things like software, intellectual property developments that are not staggering in character, not necessarily advanced capability based, but nonetheless are important contributions to getting into the innovative ladder. And indeed, this observation has been quite widely cited by people who work specifically on so-called technology markets. I prefer the term intellectual property markets because I think that has a rather narrow definition of technology, just to equate it only to intellectual property. But people like, for example, Aurora and Gambardella, so Joanne may be speaking about this later on in the conference in her keynote address, have particularly favourably mentioned our observations. In fact, it's just over the page, so I'll show you now, where you can see, although patent certainly takes off during this period, arm's length intellectual property trade in the form of licensing revenues grows exponentially by enormous leaps and bounds since the mid-1980s. So this essentially represents what's going on. These arm's length intellectual property markets have really taken off in a major way. And this, of course, comes back, Paul mentioned earlier, to international business networks. You have to be part of the networks to engage in these types of trade and investment. So the other key aspect of this, in other words, is the fragmentation of production systems, which has given rise to global production networks. So this essentially is similar or related to trends in the modularization of production, but essentially the fine slicing of production stages, which have meant that then you can break things down and you can potentially relocate at least some of those phases of activity. And so therefore there are new opportunities that arise as a consequence of this fragmentation of production systems and the selective relocation of some activities. It's possible to gain entry, as it were, into international networks through engaging selectively in particular parts of the more finely sliced value chain. And one special case of that is the case of intellectual property markets and contributions to knowledge development. So our conclusions in the case of early stage catch-up are essentially that what you have there is mainly localized and indigenous learning within a location, but it isn't necessarily closely connected to learning or knowledge development elsewhere. In other words, we don't get a significant fit on direct investment. What that's telling us is that there's no necessary involvement of major multinational companies in this process. They may be involved in some countries, but on average, they don't need to be. So in the early stages of development, you've got to get things going, as it were, on the ground with indigenous effort. And that, of course, then attracts ultimately multinational companies to come in and to consider doing more innovative activity in such a location. This finding, incidentally, also tells us that in the context of a developing country, if development isn't going well, it's not an appropriate response to start blaming the multinational firms. They weren't, responsible for this situation in the first place. On the contrary, it's only once you resolve those problems yourself and get the development process started that you will begin to attract multinational firms, and they will then consolidate and reinforce that process of development. So they can come in as development takes off. At the earlier stages, these kinds of informal institutional channels for IB connections, international business connectivity, are more important. So things like trade, subcontracting, and especially the growth of intellectual property markets. However, in the case of later stage catch-up, that's where you do need some engagement with, more direct engagement with multinational business firms and with getting in on higher order types of innovative effort by making connections with knowledge networks elsewhere in the world. This is partly, of course, because in the current age, which is the information age, which is also assisting in the connectivity between locations, what we observe is that knowledge is increasingly complex. It's complex and multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. So this connects a little bit, actually, incidentally, to wearing my GIBS hat, when we've tried to be more multidisciplinary, as you will have observed, and more interdisciplinary in character. And part of what lies behind that is a belief that this is true of the world as a whole. If we look at technological knowledge too, it's increasingly multi-technology and multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary in character. So in the real world, as academia sometimes goes in the opposite direction, where we pass out into different departments and we'll only want specialized material within our own department or our own journals, and we won't consider other people's journals as being equivalent for our purposes of tenure, promotion. In case of our department, you have to publish in the top management journals, and if you publish in finance as well, who cares about that? There's nothing to do with us. Go to their department if you want to qualify for tenure there. That's the kind of approach. But in the real world out there, outside academia, knowledge is essentially interdisciplinary. It's connecting these things that matters. It's putting them together. And so, consequently, that's also why as a new innovative location, you need connections with the rest of the world. You can't do everything in-house. If you have a clustered location, you have to have specialized expertise, just as a department would or a discipline, within a particular area of research. But then you need connections elsewhere in the world, and you increasingly need them in order to be vibrant as an innovative location. So that's where multinational firms and their networks increasingly become an important part of this story. So we find now a significant fit on the part of direct investment in later stage catch-up. So to draw some of the implications of this for geography, and one of the disciplines we've been reaching out to, by the way, in the case of GIBS, is economic geography. So I gave a talk quite similar to this, actually, not so long ago in the geography department of the London School of Economics, where actually I give a talk periodically. The department chair then happens to be a friend of mine and co-author, Simone Marino. So in terms of the geography of early stage catch-up, what we observe is that in the middle stages of a value chain, if you have a kind of smile of value creation, as Ram Madambi describes it, although he wasn't, of course, the only one, he picked this up from the marketing literature, but if you have a U-shaped smile of value creation in which the higher stages of value creation are essentially at the beginning and the end of the value chain, things like R&D, knowledge creation, and on the other side, marketing, branding, distribution, and so on. And in the middle, you have more sort of simpler assembly stages. Newer countries can get in initially at the assembly stage, at the lower points of value creation. But that can then become a potential for connecting to the other points of the value chain, the more innovative types. So in global production networks, you can get in initially on the assembly stages. These basic capabilities are now much more widely dispersed across locations. And consequently, you can, the dispersion of activity will be very much greater in those simpler types of activity, as reflected in our data, as you saw, with catch-up in licensing from around the 70s or 80s onwards. So in this case, we're slightly closer to the Friedman idea that the world is flat, that capabilities are becoming much more geographically dispersed across locations. On the other hand, when we're talking about later stage catch-up, more advanced capabilities, there we tend to see many more clustered locations. This is where the global city becomes especially relevant, and the global city region, which is interconnected with other similar global cities elsewhere in the world. In this case, in later stage catch-up, then you've got to have more advanced kinds of capability. They tend to be more specialized, more localized, and you essentially have to migrate from a development point of view along the value chain. So you have to be able to get into higher value types of activity, which doesn't necessarily mean moving to the outer parts of the value chain, although typically, historically, that's what's happened. But another point that I don't have time to develop now is I think that this value chain is increasingly in flux. So where innovative effort occurs along the value chain is also beginning to change, which is another way in which opportunities get created for new players. So in this kind of phase of development, if we're talking about multinational being attracted, coming in, and the evolution of what we've termed competence-creating subsidiaries, that is, subsidiaries that will create local capabilities, as it were, on the ground that are somehow distinct from those that were already present in their parent company, then, in this case, you can get the driving of a system into more advanced types of capability, but in this case, innovative effort tends to be more geographically localized and clustered. So in this case, we come closer to the Richard Florida notion that the world is spiky, that there are particular poles of major innovative effort. And we see this, for example, within countries. So if we're talking about China or India, we're going to be going to Bangalore, I think, next month, many of us. Or if we talk about China, Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, these locations are different. They're distinctive. There's the polarization of certain types of innovative effort. So in this case, you get major poles of innovative activity, concentrations of effort. Well, what this also suggests from a policy, partly from a policy perspective, is that these global production networks are allowing new players to come in on a rather different basis than in the past. That now you can come in to join global production networks and therefore to engage in the innovative effort across locations with a rather narrower initial stage of specialization. So this, I think, is extremely important. If we look at how the United States caught up in the 19th century with Britain, the then industrial leader, or Germany around the same period, or we look in the 20th century at the experience of Japan and Korea, what we see in each of these cases is the building of whole industrial systems at a country level. And the institutions or the business organizations that went with that were often characteristic of those places. So in Japan, you had the zaibatsu and latterly the keiretsu. In Korea, you had the chaebols. And these business groups connected together different industries within the country. So you were forming up a whole industrial system where the connections between industry, or in other words, between different types of knowledge, were made within the business group structure across areas, but within a geographically confined space. Now instead, for countries like China and India, it's possible to make those connections globally with other actors internationally. So you don't have to take on board the entire industrial complex building in the way that Korea and Japan did. So in this respect, although, everyone now, for example, has to join the WTO, so this, some development economists argue this makes it harder because you can't adopt the kind of trade policies that Japan and Korea, or formerly the US and Germany, we tend to forget this, adopted in the late 19th century. Those trade policies are out of the window. But equally, there are now new opportunities as a consequence of the fragmentation of production systems that I was mentioning earlier, and as a consequence of the fact that you can join these value chains with specialized types of activity that then connect you to other activities in the rest of the world. So in this case, we have more informal types of relationship as well, and closer connections being made between the internal and external networks of multinational firms, which then also provides opportunities for new players to break in on a project basis. So the connection here is that, multinational firms, this is another institutional change, are not just relying on in-house innovation. They're also relying on external knowledge, external innovation, and they're connecting the two. So the internal and external are increasingly connected. Incidentally, I think this is a mistake sometimes in some of the open innovation literature, which tends to treat these two as substitutes, that then says, well, because we're outsourcing or we're externally developing knowledge, that this means there's less going on in-house. Whereas very often it means that that's the condition for more in-house activity, because by connecting to relevant external knowledge, you can accentuate and develop in-house knowledge too. So the two are complementary. And incidentally, this has policy implications too, going back to the beginning, with regard to US competitiveness. That by connecting to knowledge elsewhere in the world, which may be external to the firm, that's good for the firm. And ultimately, therefore, it's good for jobs in the United States, however these arguments are sometimes presented. So this then brings us to the implications for multinational firms. The competitive advantage of more mature multinational firms now increasingly stems from their ability to integrate global production networks. So in the past, multinational firms essentially ran directly their international business networks. We almost treated synonymously, and of course it accords with the legal definition of the firm, the ownership of assets and the scope of the multinational firm. The multinational firm was essentially what it owned and directly controlled. But now, these international business networks are much looser confederations, that are coordinated or orchestrated by the activities of multinational companies. So in this case, the key contribution of multinational firms is to link and to connect together knowledge-based activities that are occurring in different locations, and to facilitate thereby the development of capabilities over time by combining internal and external knowledge to the best effect. So the locus of new capability building is now more widely distributed geographically and decentralized organizationally within multinational firms and their broader networks. And consequently, knowledge flows are increasingly reciprocal. And actually, this has caused me to remember a question I mentioned that you had asked. You actually asked me a question at a conference some years ago in Oslo. And you posed the question, well, what is the implication of this for what the received theory of the multinational firm, such as Kogut and Zander? Kogut and Zander had argued essentially the multinational firm is a social community. And so by virtue of a social community, it internalizes a lot of knowledge exchange because it directly controls and coordinates these activities. What happens when the multinational doesn't directly control, when it's in some sense also external? What's the glue that holds things together? So my argument has been, and reply to your question at the time, was, well, it's reciprocity. It's because these relationships have to be reciprocal, because you need them and they need you. And it's not just a one-off exchange either, it's an ongoing exchange. So when you're talking about new knowledge combinations, they don't come together overnight. They come together over very protracted periods of time in which all the parties have something to contribute. Therefore, it's knowledge-based reciprocity, I would argue, that holds these things, these international business networks together, because there are interests on each of these sides. And so the glue is not the formal kind of glue of ownership as it was in the past, but it's rather the glue of knowledge interrelationships. So this then leads us to suggest that multinational firms themselves have been evolving. Their dispersion of control has been loosening and dispersing. So now, whereas in the past, as described by people like Al Chandler or Heimer back in the 60s and 70s, they essentially said, well, you know, the multinational firm conforms to a pyramid structure. Oliver Williamson actually was another who took up this kind of theme. Pyramid structure in which control is essentially concentrated in the top management. And one therefore has an administrative or managerial hierarchy. But what one observes now is a kind of much more complex type of hierarchy. After some discussion with others, I concluded that this is probably not Gunnar Hödlin's heterarchy, which he suggested, which is, you know, almost the reverse of hierarchy, but it's a more complex type of hierarchy in which we have multiple poles. So each of these knowledge-based poles becomes increasingly important. They trade and exchange with one another, but of course there are power relationships that are also involved here. So as Madambi and Navarra argue, you can also get conflicts. It's not straightforward. There are kind of transaction cost issues that arise here because of the potential for conflict or disagreement. Sometimes knowledge means power, so particular poles become more powerful and therefore want to assert their position. So there are also those things that are involved now in the multinationals' management of this type of more complex and multinodal type of system. But in any event, the subsidiaries that command this kind of authority are essentially differentiating their capabilities. They have particular lines of activity that are not necessarily held elsewhere in the firm, and consequently they're able to, that's what they provide to the wider group. Now, contrary again to what some people think, this does not mean that the parent-subsidiary relationship then comes apart, because, you know, the subsidiary is now, as it were, relatively more powerful, more autonomous in these cases. The competence creating more locally embedded subsidiary is a pole of knowledge development. It requires a dual embeddedness, both in the local community but also in the global firm. This actually enhances, I have a couple of papers with Lucia Piscitello in the past year, this year and last year, in which we have illustrated how these parent-subsidiary relationships have been strengthened as a consequence of these moves into competence-creating types of activity. So as local creativity rises, as I've been arguing, you actually need more relationships with the parent firm. You need more interchange. So where you're talking about new knowledge combinations, these are not new knowledge combinations for their own sake in some isolated context. These are a diversification of the core business knowledge of the group. So in other words, you're taking the core business knowledge, which is still mainly held in the parent company, and you're diversifying that. You're taking it in some new direction. You're developing new applications, potentially also in other industries that the firm wasn't in the first place. So you're making these connections. Now, if you make these connections, you can't do it just all at the subsidiary level. You have to go back to the parent company. You have to talk to the relevant people. They, of course, become increasingly interested to the extent that the new application becomes highly relevant to the strategy of the group and to the further development of the group and its potential. So at this point, you get a stronger knowledge-based relationship between the parent and subsidiary. In the past, it might have run mainly in one direction, knowledge being passed from the parent to the subsidiary. But where it's running in both directions, and there are essentially conversations, continuing conversations that are going on between the two, I think sometimes we're misled when we talk about knowledge flows as if they're kind of, you know, they're non-personal kinds of things that are sort of somehow remotely out there, like luggage moving from one place to another. But actually, they're the consequence of personal conversations, people meeting, talking to each other. So yes, there's a geographical separation, but there's also a geographic commonality. They often have to come together to have these meetings and conversations. Just as incidentally we do in our own research teams. And we're finding incidentally in GIBS, and I think this is not specific to IB or to GIBS itself, that international co-author teams are increasingly prevalent. They're becoming more and more common. So the numbers of international co-authors are rising. But I don't believe that this means that people are just sitting in offices in a distant way, communicating over the internet or the telephone. I believe that, you know, certainly this is true of my research, but you can probably speak to your own, that where you have co-authors, you do tend to meet from time to time. And if you don't meet, you know, if you haven't met for a long time, those relationships can decay. And it's the same with inventive or research-based teams in industry. Okay, so they have to meet, they have to come together from time to time in labs. And so these knowledge relationships are actually very important. So what we therefore see is a more flexible type of global production network structure, more flexible both within the organisation, within the multinational firm, and the relationships between parent and subsidiary, but also more flexible in the sense that the project-based networks involve a greater variety of actors that come together, maybe project by project. So I would argue, in other words, that separating the internal and the external, as we sometimes do, and I can see that there are certain questions where this is appropriate, but I think it's gone rather too far. It may now often be misleading. When we need both, well, we need both the external and the internal, to simply ask the question, well, is it internal or external, may be misleading. And so I think, you know, that essentially transaction cost economics, in a sense, also has to reorient its philosophy in this era. It's not, you know, is it internal or is it external, is it make or buy, but rather under what circumstances and how do you bring these things together? How do you get systems of governance where you connect these different types of, you know, governance structure in appropriate ways? So I think kinds of informal crossover networks are essentially combining internal and external diversity in ways that enhance the innovative process, thereby enhancing or leading to greater creativity and innovative activity in the international structure as a whole. And I think I shall draw my remarks to a conclusion there and invite your questions. I think Anu said I should stick to about 45 minutes, which is, I think, what I've done now, and then we have 15 minutes or thereabouts for discussion. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions. Yes.
I had a question about the license.
Okay. Yeah.
You have
Thank you.
to use the mic because they're...
Yeah. I had a question about the licensing, the early stages of development, and how licensing feeds into or is part of the early knowledge creation. So what's the role of licensing in? Just as I don't know if you looked into that in those set of papers. So you talked about countries kind of joining the technology markets as providers, but how about what is the role of buying into countries in that early stage? Did you look into that?
We didn't. That's a very good question, because you would indeed, if my argument is right, you would expect some kind of reciprocal development. So you would expect where the revenues were rising, so also with the payments. So you would expect that kind of relationship. We didn't look at that, but that is an interesting thing to do. So we should perhaps give that as a project to a research student to investigate. Yeah, because that does imply then you're becoming active on both sides of the market. In a way that I don't necessarily think would have applied, let's say, to the case of Japan or Korea, right, in the past. I think it was more kind of incoming, as it were, payments, but now it's reciprocal, increasingly. So that's a very interesting thing to look at. That's a good point. I'm remembering also, I'll take Martine in a moment, I remember Heather asked me a question when I came to Wharton some years back about this particular topic. Yeah, I can remember all your questions from earlier. No. Heather's question was, which is kind of connected to this, was have we broken down? And the answer was we hadn't, so this was a kind of black mark, but we couldn't do with the data we had. Have we broken this down into intra-firm and inter-firm, into transactions? Because, of course, when you're talking about intra-firm, you have the transfer price issue, and you have the question, are you really sure on the valuation? So that we hadn't done, and that's another point that it would be nice to be able to break that down to the extent that we can. So Martine, I think. Oh, sorry, Heather, you want to come back to that?
On that. So it is kind of interesting. There's some new surveys that are available from the GPA that actually give you information on services. Sorry, that give you information on service payments and receipts. And there's just some interesting trends over time. We had a paper presented here last week, and we were shown some data that I think it was 70-30. Was that who was in the 70% was the external, and 30% was the internal. And so there's actually a lot of third-party licensing payments going on from US MNCs to foreign unaffiliated parties, which is actually higher than I might have thought. But they didn't break that down by country. And so with your sort of emerging countries trying to come into the global production network, there might be some interesting differences for some of those numbers.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, so we might want to talk later about some of this data.
Yeah. But that's consistent, actually, with what I was saying, which we wouldn't necessarily have expected.
Yeah, absolutely. Martine?
So my question was slightly more higher level conceptual, which is while you were talking, I was thinking a lot about the differentiated network idea. So Nitin Maria and Samantha Ghoshall's book on this, and how is your conceptualization different from that? And I think one of the areas that might be a little bit is this sort of, as I recall, they didn't emphasize the external very much. It was mostly, inside the firm thinking about it as a differentiated network. So maybe this is going beyond that in that sense. But I was curious about how you think of your vision of the multinational relative to that conceptualization of it.
Yeah, well, I had a paper which was published as a chapter in, together with my research student at the time, Yan Li Zhang, published as a chapter in the book edited by Simon Collinson and Glenn Morgan, which was Images of the Multinational Firm, which in a sense was addressing exactly the kind of question you've raised. It was entitled something like, I was asked to contribute a chapter on the innovative multinational firm. And we did indeed relate that to the Noria and Ghoshal idea, among others, There was also some work at the time by Gunnar Hedlund, which was picking up on the sort of Nanaka view as well. So yes, they are quite closely connected, I think, but except for the fact that, as you rightly point out, in their case, they were thinking very much of the subsidiary within the firm, as opposed to a wider network of relationships. And perhaps also they were thinking of this, therefore, rather narrowly in terms of parent-subsidiary relationships or interchange and the structure, the organisational structure of the firm. But the essential idea was along the same lines that I've been suggesting. So, yeah, that's true.
Hi, John. I just had two questions. One was just was wondering if you could expand further on this. On what do you think are the implications of the emerging countries having to be super specialized as opposed to building cross-industry systems, and what are the implications for their subsequent innovative activity? And then the other question I had was, you talked about maybe there's a new definition in a sense of hierarchy. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit further about that. I guess when you were saying that, I was kind of thinking of Li and Fung and the example of the fact that they basically don't need to own anything, and yet they can basically control thousands of these factories through other means. But even having their own personnel on site, and also using their using basically sales dependents to have a lot of control. And so I just was wondering, is that a kind of is that consistent with what you have in mind, or do you have something else in mind? So, thank you.
Okay. Yes, thanks for that. I think there are a whole series, actually, of possible implications about this from the development or emerging market country perspective. One is that things have very much changed in terms of the industrial philosophy, so that clearly the kind of policy perspective of an emerging market country or its institutions are not going to be the same as an advanced, mature, industrialized country. I think that's reasonably well understood already. But what I would add to that is that there are different options as well across the emerging market countries. So depending on their industrial structure or history, there are different ways in which they can engage with these global production networks or value chains. But each of those tend to involve in one way or another a greater engagement with international business. So they have to find a way which is consistent with their own traditions of engaging in these international business connections. This means from a policy viewpoint, if we go back now not so much to the business policy but the public policy, that I tend to be rather more optimistic than some people are, for example, with respect to the relationship in the long term between the United States and China. Because I think if this argument is right, these interconnections are needed on both sides. And therefore the policy implication is that industrialization, continuing industrialization in China, depends upon these links being retained. And even if they become to some extent more domestically oriented as domestic growth takes off, they need these knowledge-based linkages. And in many ways they need them more than a mature industrialized country would, which has a variety of internal links that are already there. So, for example, in some work that I did with another more recent student, Feng Zhang, which was published in Management and Organizations Review, looking at the innovative effort of Chinese companies, what we found is that, or indeed foreign subsidiaries based in China, we found that they relied very heavily on knowledge connections from the outside. Now, this is quite different in a way to what a competence-creating subsidiary would do in a country like, say, the UK or the United States. So in my paper with Ram Madambi, in the Global Strategy Journal, we found that essentially a competence, and this is consistent with a lot of other results, we found that a competence-creating subsidiary would be more likely to source knowledge locally because they would depend in part on local embeddedness as well as the dual connections with their group. But what we found in the Chinese case was that they were, as they became more competence-creating, they became more dependent on international knowledge linkages. In other words, as they really began to take off, they needed more of these more advanced kinds of knowledge-based connections. So this means there is a reciprocity that's going on there. It means that industrialization in China or in India is much more international in character than it has been in the past. And therefore, from a public policy viewpoint, it means that political institutions have to adapt to this new reality. You know, they might not like it. I mean, from the Chinese side, sometimes I think they imagine that, you know, US hegemony is retreating, and so now in, 30 years we'll have Chinese hegemony. But actually this is an entirely wrong perception, because we'll have an interconnection, we'll have a more multipolar world, and we all have to come to terms with this. We'll have to restructure international institutions in ways that are consistent with this. So I think the policy implications are extremely important, as well as the business policy issues.
Hi, thanks. So I have a bit of a kind of an off-the-wall question, and it's because I had some recent conversations with Dan Treffler, who does some work on from an international economics perspective, and he was saying that within economics there is recently like a huge kind of, they've come to it rather late, but a big interest in kind of global production networks and the role of that in driving FDI, etc. And he was saying that his intuition was that we've actually gone kind of too far down that road, and that we've to the point where we now kind of ignore horizontal FDI, and his kind of guess that actually is still where the majority of FDI is all about. Mm-hmm. So I just, I was wondering, do you have a sense of that, and where does that kind of fit in to our thinking about the dynamics, and also for that matter the politics of FDI? Because in some ways the global production network idea, it's very cozy. It's like we all benefit, etc. Right? But are we getting too Pollyanna about it? I mean, are we forgetting something here?
Well, thank you, Joanne. I think that first of all, we probably shouldn't confuse, because I don't think they're quite the same, the global value chain and a global supply chain. Because if we're talking about a supply chain, then yes, it's vertically, these connections are vertical in character. But a lot of the global production network relationships may be horizontal in the traditional economist sense. In other words, they may be within some segment of industry that overlaps, that is slightly different in these locations. So much of what I was saying is actually consistent with traditionally horizontal types of investment, not necessarily vertical. Now, with respect to the other point, we've gone too far. So this goes back to, our jobs coming back, let's say in the case of Apple, to the United States from China. Well, that's quite possible. For individual companies, there may be some relocation and then coming back to the home country. These can all happen. But all I would say is the point that I was making at the end here, that I think that we shouldn't get too focused either on the question, is it external or is it internal? Is it outsourced or has it come back? That both these things are necessary, and of course at different times they're needed in different proportions. So there is some trade-off, but we shouldn't become overly focused on the trade-off per se, because we can't get away from these international connections now. Even if we realign to some extent, the international linkages are still there. It's almost impossible to decompose things now. It's gone too far for that story to really work. And I think, many journalists, for example, haven't really understood the extent to which this fragmentation has already occurred, And therefore, it's not really relevant to kind of say, well, the whole thing could just kind of go back to how it was 30 years ago. It's not going to happen. Yes.
So maybe you can expand a little bit on the last point you make, because, well, I tend to agree with you, but as you said, when you read the newspaper and you look at the behavior of politicians, there is a lot of pressures. The UK, for example, or the US, just had to walk here to Capitol Hill and see how the tendency is towards going back. No, we want to close down. We question free trade agreements. China is the big enemy. They copy us, and so on. You know the
rhetoric.
The rhetoric. But it's not just rhetoric. If it was just rhetoric, well, you say, well, we just ignore it, give it to the masses, and we go on and do business. This rhetoric actually has real implications. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about it.
Yeah, well, of course, you're right. I mean, and one could expand on what you've just been saying. Even, I mean, it's particularly relevant in the US. It will be relevant, I think, in the US electoral debate that's coming up over the next couple of years. But it has relevance beyond that in many other countries too. You know, in the UK election, for example, that's going to be held next week, there's a party called UKIP, you know, which again is very anti-immigrant. So that's another way in which these kinds of trends. So you're right, politically, you know, people sometimes react to economic progress by saying this is a threat to my interest. But this is a fundamental development problem. I mean, this is basically the problem in the past in India or China, which somehow they've largely managed to overcome, but not necessarily entirely, which is that people tend to react in these very localized ways. You know, these are my interests, I'm going to defend them. But if everybody reacts like that, of course, development never occurs. So, you know, you've got to somehow get over those kind of tribal reactions. But I agree, it goes way beyond even the electoral debate. I mean, it goes to, you know, the re-emergence of nationalist movements, the re-emergence of kind of, you know, ethnically stated articulation of identities and so on in places like Spain, or for that matter in the UK with Scotland. So, yeah, there are lots of pressures politically that then come in the other direction that if they go too far could disturb this situation and could actually ultimately be quite dangerous, therefore. So, of course, yeah, these many debates are going to occur, and there isn't an easy answer, I think. You know, essentially we need political leadership that is far-sighted and not too parochial.
All right, well, on that note, thank you very much, John.
Thank you.